Next, from Springfield, candidates in the 18th Congressional District of Illinois face off in a debate. This pits the same two candidates that ran against each other in 2016, Congressman Darin LaHood and his Democratic challenger, Junius Rodriguez. This runs about 1 hour.
This is a candidates forum in the 18th Congressional District. The Republican incumbent, Darin LaHood, his Democratic challenger, Junius Rodriguez. Our thanks to our audience here this evening at the SJR headquarters downtown. We'd like to remind you again, please withhold your applause or demonstrations of approval or disapproval until the end of the evening. We will begin our forum tonight with opening statements, and we will go in the order determined by a coin toss just before the start of the broadcast. So the first opening statement will come from Congressman Darin LaHood.
Well, thank you. I'm Darin LaHood, honored to be here tonight. I want to thank the SJR for hosting this. I want to thank Jim and Bernie for being our moderators, and thank you, Mr. Rodriguez, for being here. It's an honor to represent the 710,000 constituents in our district and to be your representative in Washington, D.C. But I'm also here tonight as the husband to Kristen, who's in the front row with me here, and the father to our three boys, McKay, Lucas, and Teddy, and honored to be raising our children here in Central Illinois. And to be here tonight I would just remind people, we were here 2 years ago in the room right next door. And the biggest issue 2 years ago was, how do we get this economy going? How do we turn it around? We had record unemployment. We'd had a stagnant economy. And as we sit here tonight, our economy is the best it's been in 40 years, 3.7% unemployment. We've created more than 3 million jobs in the last 2 years alone. Private sector wages are up across the board. We now have the strongest economy in the world. First time we've had that in 15 years. There are more people working in this country than ever before. And I've been proud to be a part of that in Washington, D.C., voting on historic tax reform to give lower and middle class folks more of their hard-earned money, to get businesses thriving again, to let the private sector flourish. A regulatory environment that says, regardless if you're a farmer or you're in truck driving, you're in manufacturing, that we're going to give you an environment that lets the private sector flourish. And so I'm honored to be here tonight to talk about my record and look forward to the questions and debate tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Now the opening statement from Junius Rodriguez.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I want to thank the State Journal Register, WMAY, for sponsoring the event tonight. Thank you to all audience members that are here and the many thousands who are going to be watching this in the live stream and the broadcast. For the past year and a half, I've had an opportunity to campaign all across the 19 counties of the 18th Congressional District. During that time, I've attended hundreds of events. I've answered lots of questions. In fact, I've never turned down the opportunity to respond to any question that's been posed. I've conducted a town hall in every county of this district. And along the way, I've listened. One of the things that I've found is that folks in this district are looking for a congressman who is attentive to their needs, someone who is accessible, someone who is approachable, and most importantly, someone who's authentic. Now, there are folks on the other side, Republican National Committee, the GOP in general, who would say that this is a district that seems to be a safe district, a Republican lock district, one in which they would assume that PAC money, lobbyists, and others can essentially make sure that a district remains safe. But what I've heard is that people in this district are concerned about health care. They're concerned about the environment. They're concerned about Social Security. They're concerned about Medicare. They're concerned about making sure that the rule of law prevails in the United States. They are concerned about a Congress that seems to have a complicity of silence.
Your time is up. Thank you. We'll now move to the questioning. Each candidate will have 90 seconds to answer each question. We will alternate in order. By the rules that were set out ahead of time, if a candidate makes direct reference to their opponent, the moderators can award a 30-second rebuttal period at their discretion. The first question will come from Bernie Schoenberg of the State Journal Register, and we'll go first to Junius Rodriguez.
Yes, Mr. Rodriguez, welcome. A caravan of migrants from Honduras recently crossed the Guatemala-Mexico border and is still more than 1,500 miles from the United States, but on the way. If those people get to the U.S. southern border, what should the U.S. do?
Well, first of all, I would imagine that in the next 2 weeks we're going to see a whole lot of media attention to this, but keep in mind, unless they're traveling at warp speed, they won't be at the border by election time. What we have to consider is that individuals do have a legal right under U.S. federal law, and they also have a right under international law to approach a border and to seek asylum. The United States should guarantee that any individual who does approach the border, if they are seeking asylum, is given due process. We have some of the most tight vetting of individuals coming into the United States that you would find probably anywhere in the world, maybe with the exception of Israel. And as long as we are making sure that we are following our own law, following federal law, that we're guaranteeing individuals the protections that any other nation state would provide according to international law, we should certainly not separate children from parents. We should not follow the procedure that we saw several months past. One of the things that has been hinted at by the Trump administration is that that may be the direction that they're going, that we're going to see a continuation of the process of removing children from parents. That is one of the most wrong-headed policies that I think we could approach, that we could use. And if that is the case, I would hope that members of Congress, both Republican and Democrat alike, would stand together and say, these are not the values of this nation, this is not what we support, and we don't want to be the kind of nation that will separate children from their parents at the border.
Congressman LaHood.
Consistent with U.S. law, we should not allow people to illegally come into this country. And it's disturbing to me that 5,000 illegal immigrants would want to come into the United States. If you look at Mexico, for instance, which of course the migrants are going to have to travel to, they've already said they're going to do everything they need to stop this, to enforce their laws that they have on the book. But we are a country of laws, and we have to enforce those laws, and that includes the laws on our southern border. And so I would hope that the Trump administration, which I think they will, is going to enforce that law and to make sure that we stop illegal immigrants from coming into our country. And I think it sets a terrible precedent for anybody else that wants to break our laws to come into this country.
I now have, I'll ask the second question as well. This one goes to the congressman first. The White House reported last week that the government ran a deficit of $779 billion in the fiscal year that ended September 30th. That's a 17% increase from the year before. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell blamed the deficit run-up on Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, while Democrats point a finger at the tax cut signed by President Trump. How do you view the deficit, and what should be done about it?
Well, thank you, Bernie. Deficit spending is something that I ran on as a candidate 3 years ago. It's something I feel strongly about. Congress controls the power of the purse and how we spend money. And we don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. It's part of the reason why last February I voted against the omnibus budget bill that added $1.3 trillion to our deficit. Now, there were many things in that bill that I supported, but I could not vote for it. I was the only Republican member of Congress in the state of Illinois to vote against that because I couldn't see us adding to the deficit in our country and adding to that. So we have to be careful on how we spend money. And as everybody, or most people know, 65% of our budget is mandatory spending, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and we have to come up with a plan on how you solve that. But the discretionary side on how we spend money in Congress, we have to control spending. That's what my vote against the omnibus bill was about. And again, it was against my leadership, and it was against a bill that the president supported.
Mr. Rodriguez.
You may end up with a 30-second rebuttal on this one. It's a gift. I'm really wondering tonight who is going to show up, whether it's 2016 Darin LaHood, who was very concerned about deficits and debt, or whether it's 2018 Darin LaHood, who is part of a Republican majority in the House and the Congress that has been responsible for an explosion of debt and deficit that we've seen largely as a result of the tax cut bill that was enacted last year. I don't think there's really a good explanation that we can come up with in terms of why we needed to add $1.3 trillion to the debt. This is the projection from Congressional Budget Office. Simply to give a $1 trillion tax cut to the wealthiest Americans, individuals who weren't even asking for that. And then on top of that, in recent months, we've seen an effort to do tax cut 2.0 to try to provide even further assistance to those. This was billed as a middle-class tax cut. It was not. And I don't know if you haven't received the memo that other Republicans have received, but 64% of the American people are currently saying that the tax cut bill has not benefited them. They realize that it's something that gave money to the donor class primarily. There's individuals in this community, individuals in this district that are hurting. And they know that the tax cut bill that was enacted last year is largely responsible for where we're going in terms of deficit and debt.
Congressman, your opponent offered you 30 seconds. You want it?
Yes. I was very proud of my vote on the Tax and Jobs Act, and it's part of the reason why this economy is strong again and why we're on track to have 4% growth. And you see the average family of four living here in Springfield is going to get back $2,100 after taxes next year. $2,100 is not crumbs. That's real money to the lower and middle class, and it's part of the reason why our economy is going the way it is. And lastly, I would just tell you, factcheck.org has said exactly what my opponent just said was misleading. Dozens of Democrats continue to say that it goes to the top 1%. That's in fact not true. It's misleading.
Thank you. Our next question along the same lines, after we've had the discussion on the most recent tax cut plan, President Trump over the weekend proposed yet another tax cut targeting the middle class. Does America need a new tax cut plan designed in that way? And what, if any, other changes would you make to the tax code? This question goes first to Junius Rodriguez.
It's rather interesting that the President has talked about another middle-class tax cut. Congress is currently not in session, and as far as I know, most members of Congress are out campaigning. So I don't think there's any hearings going on. There was talk about this might actually come up in the next 10 days, come up before the election. So we're now actually developing proposed tax policy on the basis of magic. In much the same way that the 4% growth that's promised is somehow going to maintain itself, it's not going to be sustainable in the long run. And the idea that we are simply going to come up with a tax bill, or did come up with a tax bill last year, in which we are burdening future generations. Kids and grandkids are going to have that responsibility down the line. That is not responsible on our part. To me, a true middle-class tax cut is something that would say if you are earning $30,000, your first $30,000 would be tax-free at the federal level. Put money into the hands of the poor, the working poor, the middle class. You want to see the engine of the American economy take off, that kind of middle-class tax cut could do it. If you're hoping for trickle-down, more of the same old, that we saw failed us in generations past, and that is being tried on us again, continue down that path, but it's not working. And 64% of the American people, in the most recent survey, have basically said that the tax bill from last year has not served their interests, has not served their needs. If you get off the main roads, go into the back part of town.
Your time is up.
We'll talk about that later.
Congressman?
I would just say this. Anytime we can look at how we give more money back to middle-class folks and lower middle-class folks is a good thing for this country. I'm proud to serve on the Ways and Means Committee. I was appointed by my colleagues to that committee back in February. To have a seat at the table when we make these decisions is important for people in central and west central Illinois. But I will go back. It's hard to refute. I haven't heard anything on the other side that talks about how it's a bad thing that we have the lowest unemployment since 1969. Private sector wages are up over all sectors. We've created more jobs in the last 2 years than we did the previous 8 years. Things are moving in this country, and so when we look at tax cuts and how we get the economy going, that's a good thing for America. It's good for central and west central Illinois, and that's what we ought to be focused on.
Our next question returns to the issue of immigration. President Trump campaigned on the construction of a wall across the southern border of the United States and vowed to make Mexico pay for it. But over the last couple of years, there have been multiple proposals to spend billions of U.S. dollars on that construction. Should the United States build a wall at the southern border, and should U.S. taxpayers pay for it? Congressman Darin LaHood.
Well, I've been on the record saying this. We need to secure our southern border. There's no doubt about it. And how do you do that? Well, I think where you can build a wall in some portions of it, we ought to do that. We ought to have secured fencing. We ought to have barriers. We ought to make it a deterrent for anybody to illegally cross our southern border. And I think there's many members of Congress on both sides of the aisle that agree with that. We are a country of laws, and we have to enforce those. So I am supportive of more money that goes to securing our southern border. I also will tell you, I think we got to use technology, drones, and much of the technology that our military uses to secure our southern border. We have to make sure that we're stopping people from coming across our border illegally, and the way to do that is to enforce that. And I would also tell you, our Border Patrol agents are the ones that tell us where you can have, again, a wall, it makes sense. And there's many portions already that have a wall. So I'm going to continue to be supportive of securing our southern border and doing all we can to make sure that's a reality.
Junius Rodriguez.
I would not support a $25 billion wall at the border for many reasons. I do believe, and we agree on some points on this, that border security is something that we need to be concerned about. There's many ways that we can actually achieve that, and I think technology is one of the ways that we can do it. One of the things we've also got to remember, though, is when we're talking about those who are undocumented in the United States, there's this assumption that those are all individuals that have crossed a border, that have crossed a river. A significant number of those who are undocumented in the United States are folks that have overstayed their visa, either work visa or education visa. In other words, they didn't cross the border, cross the river to come in. They flew into an American airport and decided to stay here after their visa expired. One of the things that, if we really want to make sure that we have border security, one of the things we need to do is make sure that we are beefing up the processing of the paperwork. We're monitoring those individuals who are coming in to make sure that we have some control over that. I had an opportunity as a teacher to take students down to the border on several occasions. We actually did canoe trips on the Rio Grande to archaeological sites, 4,000-year-old archaeological sites with cave painting. And one of the things I can tell you from personal experience, there's a major American river, the Pecos River, that flows into the Rio Grande. I have no idea how you build a border wall that's going to seal off a major American river. No one's explained that to me just yet. And I have no idea of how we're going to build a border wall across Big Bend National Park. It's nonsensical.
Understood. I will move on to the next question, and this goes to Mr. Rodriguez. When the American Health Care Act of 2017, the House bill designed to repeal and replace Obamacare, passed in May of last year, it included a provision that allowed states to seek waivers that would let insurers charge higher premiums for some people with pre-existing conditions. But the bill also provided more than $100 billion over several years to help people in those states afford coverage. This was the GOP plan that ultimately didn't pass the Senate, but given the debate on pre-existing conditions, was this a good model to protect people with medical problems?
I don't think that bill would have protected pre-existing conditions, and that is also the judgment of American Association of Retired Persons, and that also is the judgment of the Congressional Budget Office, that the legislation as it was proposed would have actually weakened pre-existing conditions. Keep in mind that we talk about pre-existing conditions, and to the extent that we're talking about someone else, every one of us is going to be a pre-existing condition at some particular point in our lives. It's going to impact all of us. And I remember I attended the town hall that you did, the town hall back in 2017, 5 Points, Washington. And one of the things that you said there, and I've seen the quote many times, that you would preserve pre-existing conditions in healthcare policies. Now, first of all, you actually voted for that earlier bill. You remember the one that Trump called mean? You had actually voted for that one. And Trump said that one was too tough, that one was too mean, and then they came up with another version, and then you voted for that one as well. We need to make sure that pre-existing conditions are protected in any healthcare plan that's going to be put forward. We need to make sure that we prevent against the kind of boutique plans that they're talking about creating, where individuals can get a healthcare plan that essentially is going to deny them some of the essential benefits that have to be covered. For example, why would you want a healthcare policy that's not going to cover your prescription drugs?
Congressman LaHood.
Thank you. I was proud to support the American Health Care Act in the Congress that repealed and replaced Obamacare. Obviously, I wasn't in Congress when Obamacare was passed or the Affordable Care Act, but it clearly has turned into the Unaffordable Care Act. You look at the promises made with Obamacare. You're going to be able to keep your doctor. Didn't happen. You're going to have a lot more health care options. That hasn't happened. Your premiums and costs are going to go down. That didn't happen. And so we're stuck with a system run by the government that has not worked. And so my vote on that particular piece of legislation did protect pre-existing conditions due to the waiver in there. It also allowed people to keep their kids on their health insurance till 26, which is a positive thing, but it brought in more competition, let people go across state lines for insurance, brought in more private sector solutions. In our 19 counties that we represent, prior to the Obamacare, we had many health care options. In each county, you had 3 to 5 options for health care insurance. Now we're down to 0 and 1. It's because Obamacare has not worked. And so we came up with a solution on how you change that. And I was proud of that vote. It's unfortunate it didn't pass in the Senate, but it doesn't mean we don't keep working on it. People are paying more in this district for health insurance than they are their own mortgage. That was never anticipated under Obamacare. So we have a responsibility and an obligation, and if I'm fortunate enough to get reelected again, I look forward to continuing to fight to bring down the cost and bring more competition into health care.
Okay. Next question goes first to Congressman LaHood. The Trump administration placed tariffs on goods including steel and aluminum from some other countries, yielding retaliatory tariffs on goods including farm products. There are some new trade agreements that have been reached. How would you tell the administration to change its trade policy?
Well, first of all, I've had a voice on this, serving on the Ways and Means Committee that has jurisdiction over trade. I'm not a fan of tariffs. Tariffs are taxes. They're taxes on consumers. And frankly, it's not good for our ag economy or our manufacturing economy to have tariffs in place. And so I've spoken, when I've had the opportunity, to Bob Lighthizer, our trade ambassador, our Secretary of Commerce, and expressed my opinion on that strongly. But let me just tell you this. China's been ripping us off for 25 years. They've been ripping us off in intellectual property. They've been stealing our military apparatus. They've been doing these forced technology transfers. And I give the president credit. No president from Clinton to Bush to Obama has been able to do anything about taking China on. And we need to do something about it. And so I'm willing to give the president some flexibility, some discretion to get a better deal. You look, the Chinese stock market's down about 30%. We're having some effect on it, and that's a good thing. I don't want to be in a trade war a year from now or 2 years from now because our ag economy will be hurt. But most farmers I talk to are willing to give the president some discretion on this to get a better trade deal. And I'm happy we got a NAFTA deal done between Canada and Mexico. It's the largest trade deal that we've negotiated in the history of this country. We now have an agreement with our European allies and also with the Japanese. Those are good for our trading partners. Now we got to work on bringing China to the table, forcing them to change their behavior, and putting America first.
Mr. Rodriguez, on tariffs and trade.
Protectionism is not the right direction to go. It has not worked in the past historically. Multilateralism, working with our alliance partners, generally works much better. Problem is we've actually had problems with some of our alliance partners as a result of the tariffs that came along. One of the things that I find amazing is that our congressman is a co-chair of the House of Representatives China Working Group. That means that in this whole debate about China and about tariffs and about economic policy and them ripping us off, you have been provided one of the largest megaphones to be able to speak to this, not only to the district, but to speak to the nation. And to abdicate that responsibility is a failure of leadership, not only for folks here on the 18th, the farm community that's hurting specifically because of the tariffs, but it's an abdication of responsibility to the nation. I would love to know what kind of particular guidance you have given on the point, because it's perceived as being the co-chair of that group that you have a special kind of expertise on the topic. And if that means that you need 30 more seconds to explain it, what guidance have you given the White House on this?
You have it.
Yeah, well, I would tell you this. I'm glad you brought up agriculture because the Illinois Farm Bureau and the American Farm Bureau have looked at your record and mine, and they've endorsed me, both of them. And I'm glad to have the endorsement of agriculture in this race. And I do serve on the U.S.-China Working Group. And just what I said here tonight, I've said to the Chinese. They continue to rip us off when it comes to intellectual property. And I'm going to continue to speak out and have that platform, whether it's on the Ways and Means Committee or it's on the U.S.-China Working Group. And I'll continue to do that to fight for our farmers and our manufacturers.
Didn't answer the question.
Gentlemen, thank you both. Let's continue on. Our next question. President Trump recently announced he would end the ban on summer sales of E15, gasoline with 15% ethanol. Is that a good move, and why? That question goes first to Junius Rodriguez.
In many respects, I think that decision was made to give a break, to give a benefit to corn farmers because of the situation with the tariffs. My understanding of this is that previously the sales couldn't be done year-round, in particular in the summer months, because of concern associated with smog development, the heat and smog development. This is something that can be potentially problematic. We don't know the full effect just yet because it's something that has just been initiated. But I think what we're seeing, I would put this in the same category as the $12 billion of agricultural welfare that was provided within the past few months, where farmers were told that since there's going to be a more difficult economic circumstance because of the tariffs, that here's a benefit that can be provided to them. I wish that we could see what particular guidance there was behind the White House making this decision on the E15.
Congressman LaHood?
Well, listen, ag is the #1 industry in the state of Illinois. It's the #1 industry in my district. I support the president's decision on E15. I wish he had done it earlier. I think it's going to be helpful to our corn farmers and to corn farmers all across the country. The other thing about the ethanol industry and what it does is it helps relieve our reliance on foreign oil around the world, helps promote jobs here at home in the Midwest. And again, I'm glad he made it permanent, and I think it'll be good for the environment in the long run. And I was proud to think I authored 4 different letters that went to the administration asking them to do this over the last year, and I thought it was long overdue and good for our ag economy here.
This is News Talk 94.7 and 970 WMAY Springfield, W234CC Sherman, a live candidates debate in the 18th Congressional District, sponsored jointly with the State Journal-Register. Our next question will go first to Congressman Darin LaHood. An estimated 1.4 million people in this country identified their gender as different from how they were born. The New York Times reports in recent days that the Department of Health and Human Services is spearheading an effort that could result in a change in federal regulations and would define the sex of a person as how they were born and unchangeable. Advocates for transgender rights say that would erode protections against discrimination. Your thoughts on that proposed policy?
Well, first of all, I'm not familiar with the language on that. I haven't reviewed it. I'm not sure there's any legislation that we would vote on in Congress related to that. I'm anxious to review that and see, but I do think that, when you look at the gender that people are born by, it seems common sense would tell you that's the gender that you are, but I'm not sure that that's a legislative issue that's come before Congress at this point.
Junius Rodriguez.
One of the things that we've seen throughout the history of this country is the expansion of freedom and the expansion of liberty. You know, there were times in this country when individuals on the basis of gender alone were not treated the same, were treated unfairly. There was a time when institution of slavery existed. There was a time when Native American children were forced to go to schools to try to change them over to a different culture. I think one of the things that we're looking at here is an opportunity or an attempt on the part of the administration to really sort of turn the clock back on this notion of expansion of liberty and expansion of freedom. And again, I don't think there's any particular legislation that's been drafted necessarily, so we don't know the particulars of what policy they might be talking. But it is troublesome that this is the kind of red meat issue that would get tossed out a couple of weeks before an election, because I think what the Republican Party is trying to do in many respects is to gin up the base in whatever ways that it can, and this is one of the ways that, again, dealing with the issue of other, dealing with the issue of that which we must somehow fear. And, you know, I would put this in the same category of the way that they're dealing with the issue of those immigrants who are approaching the border. You know, this is simply stoking fear in the hearts of a lot of people, and that's not really who we are as a nation.
My next question goes to Mr. Rodriguez. Given that whoever wins this race will go to Congress with Donald Trump in the White House, please describe what you think your relationship with this president will look like.
I can get along with anybody. For real. We probably agree on a lot more things than you might imagine. I've campaigned on the whole concept of bipartisanship because I'm a centrist Democrat. That's who I am. I believe that you find pragmatic solutions in the middle. And I think bipartisanship is one of the key things. Now, you know, I've used that term, bipartisanship, and so we're probably going to hear about something like, you know, the Congress of Tomorrow project, which is one of the things that Mr. LaHood's been working on for 2 years. But what I'd suggest is roll the tape from 2 years ago with whatever he said 2 years ago compared to what he's going to say tonight, and not a damn thing's going to change. It's going to be pretty much the same. Here's the deal. Bipartisanship means that we really need to be able to listen to one another. We need to be able to find common ground. We need to work towards the middle, towards those pragmatic concepts. And if bipartisanship is something that matters, and I certainly think that it does, I find it difficult to believe that Congressman LaHood would be the person who would get us to that point. In a recent ranking of members of Congress on the basis of bipartisanship, local members of Congress, Sherry Bustos and Rodney Davis and Adam Kinzinger, got very, very high scores. Your score was not really a passing score. And so if we're going to talk about who can bring true bipartisanship, imagining you as the champion of bipartisanship is sort of like saying that Kanye West would be the champion of logical thinking.
Congressman LaHood.
Well, listen, your question was about President Trump. If I'm fortunate enough to get elected, I look forward to continuing to work with the president. I think his policies are working in this country, as is evident by the economy and where we're at. National security, the federal judiciary, putting America first, all those things are working in this country. And so I look forward to continuing to work with him. When there's issues that I disagree with the president on, I've spoken out, whether that's trade, whether that's pardoning Rod Blagojevich. I will point to an SJR editorial, thumbs up to congressmen who want to keep Blago behind bars, led by Congressman Darin LaHood. I wrote that letter to the president, got all of my colleagues to sign that, and we haven't heard anything from the president on that. Issue like the omnibus spending bill, that again, I voted against that and voted against our leadership on. On the issue of separating children at the border, the zero tolerance, I spoke out against that and that policy changed. So my job is not to opine on every tweet or everything that comes out of this administration. My job is to represent the 710,000 people that I represent in this district, their values, what they stand for. And when I see something that I don't agree with, I'm going to stand up and speak out on that, and I'm proud of my record on that.
Okay. My next question goes first to the congressman. Saudi officials now say that dissident journalist Jamal Khashoggi was killed in a fistfight in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey. Republican as well as Democratic lawmakers are skeptical of the Saudi explanation of Mr. Khashoggi's death. Should the U.S. block arms sales to Saudi Arabia or impose other sanctions at this point?
Well, I think everything should be on the table to your question in terms of looking at the arms sales, including our trade agreements that we have with Saudi Arabia. But I think it's inexcusable that it appears that a journalist, an American citizen, or a citizen or a Saudi who had a green card would be murdered in Turkey. And so I don't think the facts add up at this point, and I think we should use every mechanism possible. So I put myself in the same camp as Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio, in that we ought to be looking at how we hold Saudi Arabia accountable. I would also say this: Saudi Arabia wants to move up the world, and if this is the way that they're going to treat journalists, we ought to think twice about working with them on a lot of these issues. And so put me in the camp that says we ought to be doing everything possible to hold them accountable and make sure we get a full understanding and investigation of what occurred here.
Mr. Rodriguez.
I would agree that everything needs to be on the table. Everything needs to be considered. We've already seen some of the nations in the EU have already decided that they are going to put a halt on some of the arms arrangements that they had with Saudi Arabia. Germany in particular has moved in that direction. There's bits and pieces of information that have come out, but we don't know the full story yet, and I'm hoping that in the days to come we will learn more about this. But I think this is one of those cases where the moral leadership of the United States is really sort of on the line. Because when this issue first became an international concern, one of the things that Mr. Trump said is that there are so many U.S. jobs that are associated with the arms deal to Saudi Arabia. Initially, he said it was 40,000 jobs, and then it was 600,000. I think most recently it's 1 million. Again, this is more of an example of magic. But we cannot simply judge the policy, how we're going to deal with Saudi Arabia on the basis of those economic concerns alone. There's 130 million jobs in the United States, and so to say that one particular trade deal with Saudi Arabia would necessarily wreck the economy, no, it's not going to do that. But this is one of those cases of principled leadership. And I think whether you're Republican or Democrat, we need to stand on the side of what is right in this particular matter. And once all the details are out, I think that the United States and a unified Congress should make sure that the United States stands strong in the area of human rights on this issue.
Thank you. Our next question, one of Congress's constitutionally mandated roles is to serve as a check and balance on the other branches. How would you assess congressional oversight of the executive branch? Has it been sufficient? And what, if anything, needs to change in the coming 2 years? This question first to Junius Rodriguez.
I think in general it's been non-existent. Now, to clarify, there usually is a shelf life of about 48 to 72 hours where a certain member of Congress or a certain member of the Senate will say, I am deeply concerned about something, deeply concerned. But the shelf life of deeply concerned doesn't really last very long. We move on to a different issue in the news cycle and people sort of forget about what happened. And the news cycle, basically the fast pace at which things are happening, provides a level of what I would call political madness of sorts, where we can't stay focused on one thing for a very long period of time. The House and the Senate are both responsible for oversight. And this is not a Republican thing or a Democratic thing. This is an American thing. The framers of our Constitution wanted to make sure that we never would have an unchecked presidency, that we would never have an executive who would simply function on his own. And that's what we've witnessed for most of the last 2 years. It's terribly disappointing to watch individuals not live up to their oath. And their oath is to make sure that the Constitution is being maintained, that we are following the rule of law, and that no one in this country, including the President of the United States, is above the law. It's one of those things where there's smoke, there's probably fire. We need to make sure that the investigations run their due course, but keep in mind these are investigations that are happening outside of the congressional chambers.
Your time is up. Congressman Darin LaHood.
Well, first of all, I would say this. As a former state and federal prosecutor, I think you need to have an independent and sovereign Department of Justice. I think you need to have an independent and sovereign FBI that stands up for the rule of law. And the vast majority of the men and women that work in the U.S. Department of Justice and the FBI work every single day to uphold the law and the integrity of this country, and we ought to applaud them for that. And they play a vital role in our government. Listen, we have an independent counsel that's at work right now. And do I think it's gone on too long? Yes. I don't think it should be an unending fishing expedition. However, I'm hopeful that we'll reach a conclusion here soon. But remember, the independent counsel statute was taken away from Congress and given to the executive branch, and now is being put in place. And I think we ought to, again, let that play out, but we can't let it be unending here. But that's part of the checks and balances. I would also argue that the federal judiciary has played a vital role with checks and balances in our democracy, and we've seen that with many decisions that have been brought to the federal judiciary. So I would just say this, that I will continue to support an independent Department of Justice, an independent FBI, and make sure that we continue to have those checks and balances, because I think it's healthy for our democracy.
Next question. A recent UN report suggests the world could reach a tipping point in 12 years where the effects of climate change could become catastrophic. Do you believe man-made factors contribute to climate change? Do you accept the findings of this report? And what, if anything, should Congress do to address the issue? Congressman LaHood.
Well, a couple things. The climate is changing. I think we're all aware of that. How much of that is man-made, I think, is another issue. Now, I'm not somebody that says or uses the phrase junk science, but I think we need to figure out what is causing that, and I don't know that we've determined that yet. That's the first point. The second point I would make is I'm not a big fan of being involved with these multinational treaties and giving up our sovereignty, particularly when you have countries like India and China and other third world countries that don't abide by any of the treaty rules that are put in place. I have been supportive of CAFE standards and other technologies. We in this country have companies that continue to make strides when it comes to their environmental record, and that's a good thing. Everybody wants clean air and clean water. Every year for the last 9 years, I take my sons on a backpacking trip out west. I enjoy the outdoors, and I want to continue to make sure we have an environment that is clean and safe. But on climate change, I think we have to look at what is the science there and how do we react to that and how do we move forward, and then how do we hold many of these big polluters around the world accountable and find that balance. It's all about balance in this country. We don't want to jeopardize many of the jobs and productivity that's been achieved in this country by putting in environmental regulations that stop that. So balance is the key.
Junius Rodriguez.
I do believe that climate change is real, and I believe that human activity plays a significant role in causing that over the past 150 years. Junk science is when you have one particular study, or maybe even 1% of the studies that say one thing while 99% of the studies say another thing. And I know that at a time when, serving on the science committee, there were individuals who were sort of putting all their hopes on that 1%, the outlier, instead of looking at what the vast majority of researchers are basically pointing to. I'm a historian. I'm not a hard scientist. But even in researching and writing history, we have to act on the basis of what the evidence is. And the evidence is compelling. The evidence is overwhelming. And one of the things that Mr. LaHood mentioned was that this, he doesn't like the idea of these multinational treaties. This is exactly the kind of issue that multinational treaties exist for, because the United States on its own can't necessarily fix or solve this problem. But this is one of the areas where the United States can certainly take leadership on the issue. The United States can make sure that we're working with the concert of nations to try to adjust the kinds of solutions that we can make. Because keep in mind, that 12-year window that they were talking about, 2030 is not that far away. We're not talking about the kinds of issues that just decide a particular election. We're talking about the issues that decide the welfare of the future generations in this country.
Congressman, you can have the 30 seconds if you
Yeah,
want.
I would just, I've been supportive of above all energy policy in this country. Whether it's solar, whether it's wind, whether it's natural gas, whether it's coal, whether it's petroleum. We have diversified in this country tremendously, and that's a testament, again, to our creativity in the marketplace. But I would just say this, that as we look ahead, America is who we look at to be the leader here, and we continue to lead when it looks at energy independence, and we are now the largest energy producer in the world.
Thank you, Congressman.
My next question goes to Mr. Rodriguez. What laws, if any, should be changed to deal with gun violence?
I think a lot of the laws that are necessary are going to be laws that are at the state level. And this is not anything that's intended to pass the buck, but a lot of the legislation that's necessary is state-oriented rather than federal. But there are things that the federal government can do. I'll give you a perfect case in point. A number of years back, Congress approved of something called the Dickey Amendment. And one of the things that this did is it basically put on hold any studies that would be done by the National Institute of Health or the Center for Disease Control to investigate the issue of gun violence, whether there is indeed any kind of epidemic of gun violence in American society. Now, one of the things that we generally do is the way that policy is usually developed is we do the research, and then on the basis of the data, the policy is basically crafted from the research. If you're putting the brakes on doing the research, then nothing is ever going to come along down the line in terms of the policy that would grow out of that. And I'll use as a case in point here. Think back about 20 years ago, the position that big tobacco had in the United States, where Congress wasn't willing to take on big tobacco. They weren't willing to go after the tobacco lobby. They weren't willing to actually verify and justify the research that was out there. We've seen a cultural shift in this country with respect to tobacco over the years. And I think that the Dickey Amendment was something that actually was rescinded, and that research was allowed to go forward. I think we would see wise policy, pragmatic policy, the Congress acting where it has the legal right to act.
Congressman.
The district that we represent in downstate Illinois is got many rural areas in it, and we have one of the largest percentage of gun owners in our district. And the vast majority of them are law-abiding citizens that do everything we ask them to do in terms of compliance with a FOID card or concealed carry. And those aren't the folks we have to worry about. And so I am a supporter of the Second Amendment. And you look at Chicago has the strongest gun laws in the country, but yet has record violence in the city there. We have gun laws on the books. For instance, you can't be a convicted felon and possess a weapon. You can't be convicted of domestic violence and possess a weapon. You can't be treated for mental illness and possess a weapon, but we don't always enforce those laws. I've been supportive of more resources that would go to do that. Secondarily, when we had the tragic shooting in Las Vegas and the shooting down in South Florida, I was one of the first people to write a letter to ban bump stocks at the federal level to the ATF, and President Trump decided to do that and ban those, and that was a good thing. So there is a time and place where we ought to get involved when it comes to gun violence. I will also say this. Age restrictions on guns ought to be decided at the state level, and it's different in Illinois than it is in Wyoming or North Dakota. But looking at mental illness also, I've been a strong supporter of more money to go to mental illness for treatment. All of these mass shootings, there's one common denominator. Most of them suffer from mental illness. We need to put more money, more resources into treatment so we can stop the next one from happening.
Thank you. Next question to the Congressman. What would you do to keep the Social Security system solvent? In 2018, payroll deductions for Social Security are on the first $128,400 of income. Should the cap be lifted so higher earners pay more?
Well, I would just say this on Social Security. Right now, the trajectory of Social Security is we're going to run out of funds in 2032. And so it's not a good path that we're on. 10,000 people a day retire and go into Social Security. And I mentioned earlier, about 66% of our federal budget is tied to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So what do we do about it? First of all, if you're 55 years of age and older, we shouldn't do anything. We're not going to touch your Social Security, and we shouldn't look at that. Those are people that did exactly what we've asked them to do. We have an obligation to support them in their retirement. But if you're younger, I think we have to look at many different options. Raising the retirement age, means testing, changing the demographics so that we have a solvent Social Security system in the future. I think the fairest way to do that is to tier that approach. So if you're between 18 and 25, you're under a different system than you are from 25 to 35 and 35 to 45 and go all the way up. I think we have to look at that. To your specific question, Bernie, I'm not in favor of doing that, but I think we got to look at all options. We're only going to solve this issue in a bipartisan way. I go back to the Simpson-Bowles initiative that came forth bipartisan under the Clinton administration. Again, this is a hard issue to tackle, but it's something that we have to work on, or we're not going to have a Social Security system for our kids and our grandkids.
Thank you. Mr. Rodriguez.
Keep in mind that within the last week, Mitch McConnell made a statement to the effect that cuts had to be made to Social Security and to Medicare. This is not just dog whistle politics. This is a bullhorn. That statement was made. There are changes that can be made, and I'm not as certain that things are as dire as was mentioned that by 2032 the Social Security Trust Fund runs dry. The kinds of things that I have proposed are incremental things that can make a difference. For example, you mentioned the 128,000 cap. I would raise that to 200,000. I know of some people on the left who would say it should be on the entire amount of income that someone earns. I don't think that that would be a fair system, but I think raising it to 200,000 will give us more in the trust fund. I also do support the concept of using means testing, where for those individuals who will be able to get by perfectly well without Social Security, I think that that's something that we need to be able to consider. And so means testing, which sometimes is a Republican concept, is something that I'd be willing to take a look at. I also think that rather than raising the minimum, rather than raising the retirement age, I think what we need to do is develop options that individuals could use. For example, if someone decides to work an additional year or second year after, a third year after, give them benefits that would be pegged to the amount of the percentage of Medicare that would cover, or even get to the point where they would not need an additional health care plan.
Thank you. Our next question. President Trump suggested this week the U.S. may withdraw from a 1980s nuclear arms treaty with Russia. Should, in fact, the United States do so, and should the U.S. increase its spending on nuclear weapons? This question first to Junius Rodriguez.
The first question, I would say no, we should not withdraw from that treaty. In terms of the spending on the nuclear arsenal, I think that's the kind of decision that has to be made in the context of what other countries are doing, so I don't think a yes-no response on that is really a fair kind of response. But I think you have to do this in conjunction, association with what other major powers of the world are doing. One of the things that we have witnessed, though, in the first 2 years of the Trump administration is, in many respects, the dismantling of much of the alliance system that was put in place at the end of the Second World War. And keep in mind, this was the point in world history where the United States became a true superpower, where the United States had the ability to show leadership in the world, not only in a military sense, but also in an economic sense. And one of the other things that we were able to do during that time was to show what I would consider the essential goodness of the American people. Things like the Marshall Plan and other things came out of that, the Berlin airlift. Moving away from multilateral agreements that we have, especially those agreements that have worked effectively over the years, is going to hurt us in the long run, because unilateral policy, unilateral decision never really works that well for the United States or any nation that tries to simply impose its will, its order on the rest of the world. I would like to see a greater reliance upon using the full talents and skills of the State Department to make sure that we are working with our alliance partners. And I don't know who the new...
Your time is up. Congressman LaHood?
Well, I would just say on the proposal to withdraw from the nuclear pact with Russia, I haven't seen any justification that would warrant that. And so I'm not supportive of that at this time on pulling out of that. And then just more broadly, I would just say Again, I give the Trump administration credit for negotiating a NAFTA agreement that's good for this country, for negotiating a deal with the European Union that involves trade, for engaging in a bilateral trade agreement with South Korea. These are all positive things for our farmers. They're positive for our manufacturers, and they give us more marketplace around the world and more customers around the world. And so I think those are the type of agreements that are multinational, that are helpful to this country.
Thank you. Our next question. Who do you favor to become the next Speaker of the U.S. House and why? This question first to Congressman Darin LaHood.
Well, first of all, if I'm fortunate enough to get elected, that'll be a decision that I'll have to make. And I hope we as Republicans maintain our majority in the House. I thought Speaker Paul Ryan did a very good job over the last 3 years of his tenure in the House, and I was honored to serve underneath him. And we'll have to wait and see who steps forward, in our leadership. But we have a number of good candidates, and I will want to make sure on hearing their views and how they're going to lead our Republican Congress moving forward, and I'll make that determination then.
Junius Rodriguez.
I think that the ideal Speaker of the House, should the Democrats take the House, would be a person who is able to represent the interests and the values of the American heartland, of the Midwest, of the Great Lakes region. Now, right offhand, there's not a tremendous number of individuals who might actually fit that particular pattern, who might fit in that particular role. But one of the things that I would say, if you look at the individuals who are currently in leadership positions on the Democratic side, one of the things that I've been impressed with is that Steny Hoyer has actually made several visits to the Peoria area, and I think he's made a sincere effort to try to learn as much as he can about the issues of the Midwest. The Democratic Party needs to be a national party. Even though the large majorities of individuals who are Democrats tend to be sort of bi-coastal, I think there's a lot of folks that run very deep in the heartland who have core Democratic values, and I would like to see a Speaker who actually reflects those values.
My next question goes first to Mr. Rodriguez. What would you like to see in a new farm bill? And in particular, what is your view on the issue of increasing work requirements for adults to get food stamps?
My sympathies have always been for the little guy. And so when it comes to the farm bill, I would like to make sure that what we're doing is we're giving as much of a benefit as we can to the smaller farmers rather than to the larger industrial, mega agriculture farms. And you're putting these two things together. We have witnessed how the farm bill ends up including SNAP benefits, because this is one of those things that happens in Washington, the old you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. We're talking about essentially two different kinds of subsidies here. There's a subsidy that's essentially gone to the farm community, and then there's a subsidy that's gone to those individuals who are low income. And both sides might find it difficult to be able to summon enough votes to be able to put both of these things as standalone bills and get them approved. But by putting them together, you actually get people to say, well, we'll support the farm subsidies if you support the SNAP benefits. I think that that's a program that should be maintained. I would not like to see those two things get separated out. I think it can work effectively. In terms of work requirements, currently I think it's almost 65% of those individuals who are receiving SNAP benefits are actually working. And so we have to be careful. This is another one of those areas where we're trying to demonize those who are poor and demonizing those who struggle, and I think that's wrong-headed policy.
Thank you. Congressman?
Well, I proudly supported the Farm Bill in the House that included work requirements for SNAP recipient benefits, recipients. And remember, SNAP is a Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And it's unfortunate that our Farm Bill, which is negotiated every 5 years, 80% of that is welfare benefits, and SNAP is a part of that. But let's remember what we've said in this bill. What we've said is, if you're an able-bodied working person between the age of 18 and 59, you don't have any young children, we're going to ask you to have work requirements to receive your benefits. So we're not talking about elderly people that need food stamps. We're not talking about young women that have children. We're not talking about people with disabilities that need food stamps. We're talking about able-bodied working people. Now, we have 7.1 million unfilled jobs in this country today. Unfilled. We can't find enough workers. And what we've said is, why don't we transition people that are able-bodied working folks off of SNAP and off of food stamps and do that? To me, that makes a lot of sense to do that. But unfortunately, our Democratic colleagues won't agree to that, and so that's held up the Farm Bill, and that's where we're at on this. But I think that's where we ought to go. And listen, we're all for helping people that need a hand up, and that's what the SNAP program is all about. But I look at it, the best social service program in this country is a JOB, is a job. And that's what we're trying to do. It's going to save taxpayer money in the end. And that's our biggest disagreement with the Democrats is we want to reform SNAP. And so, listen, we need a farm bill. If I'm fortunate enough to get elected and we go back, I'm going to work as hard as I possibly can to get that done by the end of the year.
Thank you. My next question starts with the congressman. In Illinois history, who is your favorite governor and why?
My favorite governor? Well, I would say this. Governor Jim Edgar is somebody that I grew up under. I think he set a high standard for integrity, for representing the values of Illinoisans. Somebody that was ethical, which I respected. He was humble, and when he needed to be, he was tough. And I think he set a good example for all of us, and he's somebody that I respect today. And I think his Edgar Fellows program, which helps with young people in the state. I'm a proud graduate of one of the first programs he set up on that, and he's somebody that I respect a great deal.
Thank you. Mr. Rodriguez.
The second governor of Illinois, Edward Coles, in many respects should be the patron saint of the state of Illinois. He was originally from Virginia, moved here back in the 1820s, I believe. He was a contemporary of Madison and of Jefferson. He had been a slave owner in Virginia, came to Illinois, emancipated the individuals that he owned, saw to it that they were educated. But most importantly, during his tenure as governor in the 1820s, he was the governor who was most responsible for making sure that a new state constitution was not put together that would have permitted slavery in Illinois. And so Edward Coles, this Virginian who had been a slave owner, who had become an abolitionist, became the champion for human liberty, became the champion for civil rights, and made sure that Illinois remained a free state as had been ordained under the terms of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787.
Thank you. Candidates, we have time for one more question. It will be in the area of infrastructure improvements. What would be your preferred method for paying for a package of infrastructure improvements around the country? This question first to Junius Rodriguez.
Well, the first thing to mention is I would love to serve on the Transportation Committee. It's one of the committees that I hope to be able to serve on, because I believe that in the next Congress there will be a bipartisan infrastructure bill that comes along, and I believe that it has tremendous capacity where it can benefit this district in so many ways, not only in terms of dollars that would be expended here on projects, but also in terms of our manufacturing sector that will benefit tremendously from this. How to pay for it? Well, for one thing, you know that $1.3 trillion that we talked about earlier? I think we can put that to a much better use. And I think that we can find a way that Republicans and Democrats can say, if we really want the moonshot for our generation, if we really want to see what we can do to make sure that American infrastructure can be just as good, just as competitive as what other nations of the world have had really for several decades now, we have to find the willingness, the capacity to be able to invest in that. It's one of those ways that we can jumpstart the American economy, that we can produce jobs. It would have a tremendous impact here in the 18th, and I look forward to the opportunity to try to make that happen. And that, by the way, going back to an earlier point, that is one of the ways that I'd be willing to work with Mr. Trump, because he also has supported an infrastructure bill, and I recently have signed on to a pledge saying that I would support a $1 trillion infrastructure package.
Congressman?
Listen, I've been supportive of an infrastructure plan. The President announced a $1.5 trillion infrastructure plan in his State of the Union address. I'm supportive of that. Our roads and bridge need upkeep. Our rail system needs upkeep. You look at the rail realignment project right here in Springfield that I've been a big part of. We've gotten 2 Tiger grants over the last 5 years. It's a project that would be well suited for an infrastructure bill. As we look at this, this is a bipartisan issue, and I look forward to working with my colleagues on that. How you pay for it, I think that's the big issue. A lot of people have talked about you're going to raise the gas tax, or maybe put in a carbon tax, or maybe you look at public-private partnerships. I don't think public-private partnerships make sense in a district like ours that is very rural. They may make more sense in urban areas where you can get a return on investment, but we're not going to build a toll road between here and Jacksonville and have people pay for it. We're just not. So figuring out how you pay for it. I think you're going to need leadership from the administration on that, on how you pay for it. President Trump, about a year ago, tweeted that he was open-minded on the gas tax. We'll see if he comes through on that and supports that. But there is an appetite for bipartisanship. And I think the other thing that I give the President a lot of credit for his infrastructure plan, he's talked about 20% going to rural America. That's going to go to our locks and dams. It's going to go to our rural areas, to our bridges. That's important. So I look forward, if I'm fortunate enough to get elected, to playing a role in that.
Candidates, thank you for your time and your answers this evening. It is now time for closing statements, again determined by a coin toss before the forum began. And so the first closing statement will come from Congressman Darin LaHood.
Well, an hour goes by quick. I want to thank everybody for being here. I enjoyed the dialogue and the discussion. It's an honor to represent you in Washington, D.C. And I tell people I learn every single day in this job. And I come back every weekend to this district. And I love my job and what I do. And what I said when I ran for this job is we would focus on three things. One is good constituent service. Regardless of what your issue is, when you call up our office, we're going to navigate whatever issue that is. Maybe you're a senior citizen, you're not getting your benefits. Maybe you're a veteran, and we got to reacclimate you back to the United States and get you the education you need. Maybe it's a visa or a passport that you need. We're going to be there for you, and to work as hard as we can on good constituent service. Secondly is voting. I tell people all the time, when I go to Washington, D.C. and I have to vote, I got a yes button and a no button. I don't have a perfect button. But I've tried to make those right decisions on what I vote on comprehensive tax reform, standing up for the conservative values of Central and West Central Illinois, for hard-working people. And lastly is to advocate for my district, to advocate every single day as hard as I can for our farmers and our hard-working folks in Washington, D.C. And I've been honored to have that responsibility over the last 2 years. I don't take it for granted. I love the job that I have. I love raising my family here. I'm proud to be from Illinois. And if I'm fortunate enough, I'll look forward to asking for your vote to go back and represent you for another 2 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. And now from Junius Rodriguez.
The people of this district are not really asking for much. All they're asking for is an honest break. They're asking for a chance. They want a congressman who is willing to listen and a congressman who's willing to represent all of the people that vote for you as well as the people that don't vote for you. In my travels across this district and the town halls that I've held, one of the things that I've tried to do is to make myself as accessible to individuals as possible, to answer whatever questions were presented. What folks really want is a chance to make sure that those who are struggling in this district, and yes, there are people who are still struggling in this district. The economic numbers nationally belie the situation here. We've still got a lot of folks that are working 2 jobs. They're part-time jobs. They're not necessarily getting the benefits that they deserve. I wonder sometimes why we see members of Congress who seem to lack the kind of empathy for those who struggle, for those who simply want their kids to have a better opportunity than they had, for those who are not asking for the moon, but they're simply asking for the kinds of things, the small amenities that can make their lives just a little bit better. Tax cuts won't provide that. The folks in this district are hurting. And what I'm doing is asking people to give me a chance to listen, to represent, to be your voice in Washington. Thank you so much. Thank you for hosting this. It's been a great evening.
Congressman Darin LaHood and Professor Junius Rodriguez, thank you both. To our audience, thank you for your attentive interest this evening. Please show your appreciation for our candidates here tonight.